Here on the Colour of Country Life, FlowFM, we're speaking with the Shadow Assistant Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, Tony Passon from Canberra. How are you, Tony?
Morning, Ricky. I'm well.
Now, you've been one of the regular supporters of the Building Better Regions Fund and projects in your own electorate. We've just spoken with Catherine King, unapologetic for the removal of that fund. Just what do you think this is going to mean in regional areas?
Well, in regional areas, it means that organisations, not-for-profits, local councils won't have access to a fund that can deliver real outcomes on social capital projects. I mean, I could give you a long list, a very long list, of projects across your listener area that benefited from Building Better Regions funding, whether it's rec centres in the Riverland, an airport upgrade in Mount Gambier, Barossa Community Helpers, very close to where you're broadcasting from, Ricky. They were in rented accommodation. The floor was earthen floor. We, through that program, were able to build them a purpose-built facility. This is an organisation that raises money for the broader Barossan community, and to whip those opportunities away is ridiculous. And for those applicants who made application around 6, spent money, time, waited 10 months. I think this is an incredibly disrespectful way to treat them.
Well, something peculiar. I've been in politics for some time, as has yourself, Tony Passon, to see councils putting out press releases saying they are disappointed at the axing of the program and saying we had an application in for the Boolaroo Centre swimming project, or the Barossa Council said they had something for community arts. Councils are pretty angry about this. Yeah,
and the reason you don't normally get those press releases is because they want to carry good favour for a future application, but they realise, I think, that this is such a valuable program that was making such a difference. But the bigger question for regional councils in South Australia right now is when they look at the Minister's press release that says, the following 2 projects are outstanding regional development projects that are being funded under the budget. One is in Marion, and the other one is at Glenelg. Now, that says to regional councils that the Minister for Regional Development, Fredgley, doesn't know where regional South Australia is. And in terms of people living in Adelaide, it alternatively says that, well, from a federal government's perspective, we regard Adelaide as some sort of a backwater and not affording Adelaide the status it deserves as one of our nation's capitals.
Well, the Minister King said, I'll put it to her, that Dan Tehan's comments, your neighbour in the electorate of Wannon, complained that the replacement for BBRF wouldn't be of the same scale. She claimed that it would, but then they've got this place-based fund. It does sound to me like it's going to be focused, say, on regional centres like, say, a Wagga Wagga or Dubbo, rather than maybe small towns like Pinaroo.
Yeah, the point here is there's $1 billion over 3 years across 2 programs. So even if we would divide the billion 6 ways, as we should, it's $150-odd million. So it doesn't match the $250 million for BBRF equally. But what will happen here, Ricky, and I guarantee you this will happen, there'll be a much greater sum allocated to these precincts they're talking about. They're talking about regional areas with university presences. Now, there's effectively one location in my electorate, Mount Gambier, the largest city outside of Adelaide in South Australia that has a bricks and mortar university presence. I mean, the reality here is they don't understand what small but vibrant regional communities look like, and I think more than that, they don't much care because those people don't come with significant political clout, and you'll see them develop guidelines and therefore justify, this whole idea that they're holier than thou. They'll develop guidelines that work for regional centres that they represent, because on average there are, if you find a Labor member who comes from a regional area, they come from somewhere like Newcastle or Wollongong, not Pinaroo, Lameroo, or Penola or Naracoorte. So they'll develop programs that work for that size community, and it'll just make it impossible for small communities, which is the overwhelming majority of people I represent.
Well, speaking of things that are impossible, Catherine King herself acknowledged in the electorate of Ballarat, it's hard to drive around at the moment, all the potholes developing. You said on the Sturt Highway it's getting terrible, but she didn't seem terribly across freight projects like the Murray Basin Rail project in Victoria that would get a whole lot of trucks off of roads and bumper harvests off of the roads and into the rails.
Well, Ricky, the former federal government was heavily invested in the Murray River Rail project. The challenge with that project, like all infrastructure projects across the nation, is they're ultimately managed by state governments. And the Andrews Labor government, either deliberately or I think incompetently, has so badly mismanaged that project that more and more and more and more money is required. The problem, the real problem, is that, in my view, it's deliberate what is occurring. And we're seeing now, and I'm sure you'll ask me about it, this batshit crazy idea of the Suburban Rail Loop in Melbourne. For your listeners' benefit, accurate estimates put it at about $200 billion worth of a project. So that's $200,000 million. The Andrews government, in the lead up to the election, has announced that with great fanfare, they've managed to hoodwink the Anthony Albanese Labor government in Canberra to give them $2.2 billion towards it, which is a long way short of the $100 billion that they would need to if they were going to progress with this project. I think Albo himself is sceptical about this project. But the reality is this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a reprofiling of our nation's infrastructure spend away from productive freight infrastructure in our regions to, vote-winning pet projects in the cities that, shave 10 minutes off a journey between, to urban centres.
Yeah, that's what seems very odd to me, is that you've got a regionally based MP like Catherine King, and yet under her watch there, under her portfolio, funding's going to a suburban rail loop rather than helping with freight. And that's a story all over the nation. Even Inland Rail, Labor's now bringing in this new person to oversee Inland Rail at cost blowouts and the like. It just doesn't seem that the focus is on, the price tag can't be, there's no concern about the price tag with Suburban Rail Loop, but they're concerned about how much regional freight costs.
Oh, and it's not just a Suburban Rail link. There's also now this project around high-speed rail out of Sydney to Newcastle. I mean, I feel like when I read about these projects, none of which are supported by Infrastructure Australia, and in the case of the Suburban Rail Link, of course, the Auditor-General in Victoria rejected it and said that if you spend $1 on that project, you'll only get 51 cents back in terms of economic dividend. But when I read these proposals and I dive into them, Ricky, I can't help but think that I've just, become an extra on the Simpsons episode that talks about monorail.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one.
Seriously.
The man with the candy cane and the fancy hat.
Exactly. And, Of course, you remember when he came to town, everyone, thought it was brilliant, and he was, this suave man from out of town with this great infrastructure plan for Springfield. By the end of the project, it was just a kind of infrastructure wasteland, and that's what's happening here. It's all bread and circuses, and at the same time, the freight network that's doing the heavy lifting. And let's not forget that our budget, on the revenue side, is incredibly healthy because of extraordinary revenues that are coming out of agriculture, mining and fossil fuel industries, the same industries, of course, that are demonised by this government, but they're happy to receive those extraordinary revenues. So the infrastructure that's supporting those productive elements and profitable elements of our economy are failing, and we're not doing anything to support them or develop them or nation build them, but what we're doing is these pet kind of infrastructure projects in urban Australia. I've had my own experience, Ricky. Your listeners might know that my family has a small farming enterprise in the southeast. On one of my days off, my dad asked me to go to a ram sale. We bought some rams. I never take the trailer to a ram sale because I'm not certain that we'll end up with any. I went home and I hooked up the trailer and drove to this place on Kangaroo Flat Road, actually, at Glencoe. Only to arrive at the farm that we bought the rams at, and someone said, "Oh, you've got a flat tyre." I'd hit a massive pothole about 5 k's down the road, and I've said, "Oh, I hit that pothole," and they just looked at me and said, "You're from the government. It's your fault." And I thought to myself, I'm in opposition, but it's absolutely true that these roads are now at the point that not only are they unproductive, they're actually costing money and indeed tragically costing lives.
Yeah, and there's coming back to the original topic you talked about at the start, Building Better Regions Fund, it was attacked for rorting and not being value for money by the government. That's the implication the minister's given in the full interview we've talked about. They might claim there's an inevitability about high-speed rail and suburban rail loops, but surely if the cost-benefit doesn't stack up, it's just as good to do regional rail and other projects as it is to do a suburban rail loop.
Well, that's the point of Infrastructure Australia, Ricky, is it was established in order for the government to receive advice about where the best place to allocate your next infrastructure dollar is. And the way we do that is on benefit cost ratios. And the higher the benefit cost ratio, the more worthy a project, the more likely it is to be funded. But of course, none of these projects, whether it's high-speed rail out of Sydney or the Suburban Rail Link, have the support of Infrastructure Australia, and yet they're going to proceed anyway because this is cash for votes. And it's not about what's in the national interest, it's actually about what's in the Labor Party interest, and you'll watch this infrastructure morph itself away from productive assets, which just happen disproportionately to exist in the regions. That's what we do. We dig, grow and process product and take it to port, so we need the roads. To electorates in and around metropolitan areas that are held disproportionately by the Labor Party. That's what will happen here. And having living through a very wet period right now, we're going to see accelerated damage done to our roads because, of course, water plus freight movement equals deterioration. And there are a couple of roads, in my electorate that I'm particularly concerned about, the Mallee and Karoonda highways. This is the first time since, Ricky, we haven't had a rail line through that country to Tailem Bend that we've had a significant harvest. And I think by the end of the harvest, if it ever dries up enough so that we can get out onto those paddocks and harvest them, I think those highways, those roads will look like they've been rotary hoed because the amount of trucks that will be on this road, it just doesn't bear thinking about.
Well, Tony Passon, member for Barker, we'll drill into what's in this budget, if anything, for the electorate of Barker a bit later on. It might be a much shorter conversation, Tony.
Yeah, well, I think it will be. And look, at the end of the day, Ricky, I mean, our focus in this discussion in my portfolio space has been around infrastructure spend. But, Australians should feel dudded as a result of that budget. It was a budget that did nothing to help them with their family budgets, and it belled the cat on a significant lie that was uttered in the lead up to the election. You'll recall that not only did Anthony Albanese say he'd address cost of living pressures and he'd drive up real wage growth, neither of which he's now conceded he can do, but the big daddy was he said he would drive down electricity prices. He even put a number on it, $275 cheaper per year. Well, the budget confirmed that electricity prices over the course of the next 2 years are going up by 56%. And that's because the bureaucracy, having looked at the policy settings of this Labor government and their zealous zeal pushing towards renewables far too quickly, have said, well, this will be the cost of doing that, and we need to put that assumption in the budget. And I think this will petrify average Australians who are already anxious about their electricity bills.
Yes, again, thanks, Tony Passon. Always plenty to talk about. We'll catch up with you soon again about what's happening in Barker. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Cheers, Ricky.